His name was Augustus. Rome called him father of his country. History called him the man who gave the world 200 years of peace. Poets wrote of him. Emperors imitated him. Statues of him still stand in museums across Europe. That same calm face, that raised hand, that expression of absolute serene authority. He is perhaps the most successful ruler in the history of Western civilization. And before any of that, before the titles, before the peace, before the golden age, he sat down at a table with 2 other men and wrote a list of people who needed to die. 300 senators, 2,000 knights, and then he signed it. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. In November of 43 BC, before the sun came up over Rome, lists appeared in the Forum. Whiteboards, ink, names, thousands of names, posted at the city gates, nailed to the walls, impossible to miss and impossible to misread. Every Roman who walked into that square that morning understood instantly what those lists meant. Not war, not battle, not some distant conflict in a far province. This was happening here, in the city, on the streets where they lived. The men whose names were on those boards were already, legally, corpses. They just didn't know it yet. The reward was 2,500 denarii for a head. Any head on the list, brought in, severed, to the men in power. Rome did not riot. Rome went quiet. That silence is the most important detail in this entire story. Not the killing, hun. There would be plenty of that. The silence of a city that has just understood that the rules have changed, that the men with the power have decided the old lines no longer apply, and that the only question left is whose name appears on the next list. Romans had survived civil war. They had watched Caesar cross the Rubicon. They had watched him fall in the Senate. They had seen chaos before. But this was not chaos. This was order. This was bureaucratic, systematic, organized murder, with a legal framework, a reward structure, and a government stamp of approval. 3 men wrote those lists: Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Mark Antony, and a boy of 19 who had taken the name Gaius Julius Caesar, who the world would one day know as Augustus. He signed the death warrants. The rest of this story is about why, and what it cost, and what it built. You cannot understand the proscriptions without understanding the 18 months that preceded them. Because what happened in November of 43 BC was not an eruption. It was an endpoint. Every decision, every miscalculation, every power grab in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination had been pointing toward this moment with something close to mathematical inevitability. Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, 44 BC. The men who killed him had a plan to end a dictatorship. What they did not have, what they had never thought through, was a plan for the morning after. Within days, the liberators had lost the political argument. Within weeks, they had lost Rome. Brutus retreated to Greece. Cassius went east toward Syria. They left behind a city with no leader, no clear authority, and several very powerful men who had just watched the most dominant figure in Roman politics get stabbed 23 times, and were now calculating what that meant for themselves. Mark Antony moved first. He was the consul. He had Caesar's papers and Caesar's personal files, which meant he had leverage over half the Senate and every political debt Caesar had accumulated over decades. He had the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, real soldiers, battle-hardened, devoted to the memory of the man they had followed from Gaul to Egypt, to the banks of the Rubicon. He was 40 years old, and he was the most experienced political operator alive in Rome. He did not want the Republic restored. He wanted what Caesar had built, on his own terms, with himself at the center of it. Then came the will. Caesar had left his estate, his political network, his accumulated power, and his name. Not to Antony, not to any senator, not to any general. He had left it to a boy, Gaius Octavius, 18 years old, studying across the Adriatic in the Greek city of Apollonia. Unknown to the legions, untested in war, unimpressive by every conventional Roman standard. By adoption, he was now Gaius Julius Caesar, and he intended to collect everything that came with that name. Antony laughed. He was not alone. Octavian crossed the sea anyway. He came to Italy and told anyone who would listen that he was Caesar's heir, and he intended to be treated as such. He had no army, he had no office, he had nothing except a name and the iron confidence of someone who either understood exactly how much that name was worth, or was too young to understand how easily he could be destroyed. Either way, the effect was the same. Men came to him. Veterans who had served under Caesar came to pay their respects to Caesar's son, their son. The Senate, led by Cicero, saw something else entirely, a useful weapon. Cicero was the greatest orator in Roman history. He was also, at 63, a man who had spent his entire career fighting for the institutions of the Republic and watching them erode. He understood what Antony was becoming, a new Caesar, another strong man who would absorb the Senate into his own ambitions and call it governance. Cicero could not fight Antony with legions, so he backed the boy. He gave speeches calling Octavian a gift from the gods. He maneuvered the Senate to grant him rank, authority, and military command, all to be pointed at Antony like a blade. Cicero's private assessment of Octavian, in a letter to a friend, was 3 words of Latin: laudandum, ornandum, tolendum. The young man should be praised, honored, and then disposed of. It was the most consequential miscalculation of Cicero's life. It was also, in its way, the most consequential miscalculation in the history of the Roman Republic. For the next year, Rome existed in a state of suspended collapse. Antony fighting in the north for control of Gaul, the Senate backing Octavian against him, Brutus and Cassius, far to the east, building what would become at its peak 20 legions, the last great Republican army in history. And Octavian, in the middle of all of it, accumulating, slowly, carefully, waiting for the moment when he could stop being someone else's instrument. That moment came in the spring of 43 BC. Both Roman consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, died fighting Antony near the town of Mutina. The Senate's military position collapsed overnight, and the Senate, with the particular genius of an institution that has just run out of options, ordered Octavian to hand his legions to Decimus Brutus, one of the men who had stabbed his adopted father 23 times on the floor of the Senate House. He refused. One word, one decision. That refusal was the hinge on which everything else turned. Because in refusing, Octavian made clear that he was done being the Senate's weapon. He had another use in mind for himself entirely. The meeting took place in October of 43 BC, on a small island in the Lavinius River near Bononia, what we now call Bologna. The island was chosen deliberately. Water on all sides, guards on both banks. No one could approach without being seen. No one could leave without permission. What was said in that room over 3 days was never recorded with any precision. What emerged from it changed the world. 3 men, 3 armies, and a problem they all understood. Lepidus was there because he had 17 legions in Gaul and Spain. He was not a great man. History has been consistently unkind to him. and the evidence suggests history is correct. But 17 legions, in October of 43 BC, made him essential. Without him, Antony and Octavian would likely destroy each other before either could deal with the real threat. With him, the math was overwhelming. Antony came as the senior partner. He had governed provinces, fought wars, stood over Caesar's body, and turned a crowd of mourners into a political weapon with a single speech. He was the most experienced man at the table by a significant margin. He also needed something he could not generate alone: money. Enormous amounts of it, enough to march 40-plus legions across the Adriatic, sustain them through a campaign of unknown length against Brutus and Cassius, and pay them afterward. He knew where that money was. It was sitting in the estates of Rome's richest and most politically inconvenient men. Octavian came with something neither of the other two had: the name, just the name, Caesar, and what that name could still do to veterans, to the public, to the wavering loyalties of men who hadn't yet decided which side of history they wanted to be standing on when this was over. He was 19 years old, and he was already thinking past the island, past the meeting, past the war against Brutus and Cassius, toward a question no one else at that table was asking yet. What comes after? They negotiated for 3 days. The broad outlines were not complicated. Antony would take Gaul. Lepidus would keep Spain and Narbonese Gaul. Octavian would govern Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily. All three would jointly control Italy. All three would march together on Rome. And then, this was the part that required 3 days to agree on. They would destroy their enemies. The list was not made in a fury. It was made in calculation. Brutus and Cassius in the east were the existential threat, the military problem that had to be solved before anything else could be secured. But solving it required a war chest, and the war chest required the dead. 300 senators, 2,000 equestrians, their property, confiscated the moment their names went on the list, would fund the Eastern campaign. This is the detail that changes everything about how you understand the proscriptions. They were not a political purge dressed up as financial necessity. They were a financial operation dressed up as a political purge. The killing was the means. The money was the point. The 3 men on that island did not lose control and sign death warrants in a moment of rage. They built a budget and filled it with names. Within 3 days at Bononia, the second triumvirate had been born. The Senate's power had been scheduled for destruction, and 300 men were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The triumvirs left the island and marched their armies toward Rome. Rome had laws. It had always had laws. Laws against armies crossing the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. Laws against arbitrary execution. Laws against the concentration of power in the hands of any single man or group of men. Centuries of constitutional precedent, accumulated through the slow, painful process of a civilization learning what happens when those laws are ignored. Those laws had stopped working the day Caesar crossed the Rubicon 12 years earlier. What the triumvirs understood, what the Senate could not bring itself to accept, was that legality in Rome had always been downstream of force. The law did not constrain the armies constrained the law. You did not break the rules, you rewrote them. And to rewrite them, you needed a tribune willing to propose the legislation and a Senate too frightened to vote no. Both were available. A tribune named Publius Titius, a man whose name would otherwise mean nothing to history, proposed the Lex Titia. The law was precise in its language and breathtaking in its scope. It created the Tres Viri Rei Publicae Constituendi. 3 men charged with reconstituting the Republic. 5 years of authority, essentially unlimited executive power, the ability to legislate, to appoint, to confiscate, to execute, all of it, without appeal, without review, without any of the checks that the Republic had spent 5 centuries building. And to make the point absolutely clear, the triumvirs had marched their armies into the city to stand in the streets while the vote was held. The bill passed swiftly. In a single afternoon, the Roman Senate legalized its own destruction. It did not do so because senators had suddenly decided that tyranny was a reasonable form of government. It did so because every man in that chamber understood the same thing. The alternative to voting yes was not a constitutional debate. The alternative was a name on a list. So they voted. And with that vote, the proscriptions moved from a plan made on an island into a legal instrument of the Roman state. The lists appeared before dawn. 17 names to start. Only 17. That was the announcement made by Lepidus, one of the year's consuls, who told the city that only these 17 men were targets. Everyone else was safe. The panic was understandable but excessive. The situation was under control. Lepidus died the following day. Officially, exhaustion. The city understood. The reward was 2,500 denarii. That number requires context. An ordinary Roman laborer earned perhaps 1 denarius a day. 2,500 denarii was nearly 7 years of wages, handed to whoever delivered a prescribed man's head. Severed, carried in, presented to the triumvir's agents. Additional rewards for information about a fugitive's location. Death for anyone found harboring one. And if you were added to the list, everything you owned was forfeit the moment your name appeared. Your house, your land, your bank accounts, your slaves. You became, in legal terms, a non-person, a corpse that had not yet stopped moving. The architecture of this system was brilliant in a terrible way. The triumvirs did not need to do the killing themselves. They did not need an army of executioners or a secret police or any of the apparatus of modern totalitarianism. They needed economics. They set a price, opened a market, and let Rome do the rest. Every citizen became a potential asset. Every slave became a potential informer. Every neighbor became a potential threat. The moral cost of the killing was distributed across the entire city so broadly that no single person had to feel the full weight of it. This was not a feature of the system. It was the design. Night after night, more names appeared. The 17 became 100. The 100 became 300. And then the list stopped being only about politics. Some of the names appearing in those nightly postings were men who had estates someone wanted. Some were men who had offended the wrong person at the wrong moment in their career. Some were men whose sons were eager to inherit early. The machine, once activated, began drawing fuel from sources that had nothing to do with the original purpose. It fed itself. The historian Appian, writing more than a century later but working from sources close to the events, gives an account that does not read like scholarship. It reads like testimony. Men hid in sewers, in wells, in chimneys, in ovens. One man, Appian tells us, concealed himself in a dung heap. The soldiers who found him were too disgusted to reach in and pull him out, so they stabbed the heap with their spears, methodically, thoroughly, until he crawled out on his own. Then they killed him. Brothers were found holding each other, executed together in a single stroke of the blade. Children were not safe. Orphans who had inherited substantial sums were added to the lists, their money more valuable than their lives. One boy was found at his school when the hunters came through the door. His tutor threw himself in front of the child to shield him. Both were cut down without hesitation. Wives informed on husbands. Children eager for their inheritance reported their fathers. Friends who had shared meals the week before found themselves doing quiet arithmetic about the value of a betrayal versus the risk of loyalty. No one knew if the list had grown overnight to include their own name. That uncertainty, that permanent grinding not knowing, was not a side effect of the system. It was one of the system's primary products. A city that does not know who is safe, cannot organize, cannot resist, can only wait. For the triumvirs, this was working exactly as designed. Among all the names on all the lists, one mattered more than any other. Not because of military power, he had none. Not because of political office, he held none. But because of what he represented, and because of what his silence would signal. Marcus Tullius Cicero, 63 years old, the greatest orator Rome had ever produced. For 30 years, the most articulate and persistent voice of the Republic, and in the 18 months since Caesar's assassination, the man who had turned that voice into a direct, personal weapon aimed at a single target. Mark Antony. The Philippics, 14 speeches delivered in the Senate across several months, were acts of extraordinary political courage. Cicero called Antony a drunk, a fool, a tyrant, a man who had sold himself in his youth and now intended to sell the Republic in his middle age. He said these things publicly in the Senate chamber, with Antony's veterans within marching distance of the city. He said them knowing exactly what they cost, and he said them anyway, because Cicero believed, genuinely, entirely, perhaps fatally, that the Republic was worth defending with every tool available to him, and the tool he had was his voice. When the lists appeared, Cicero's name was on them. Antony had demanded it. That much is certain. The question history has never fully resolved, and it matters because it changes how we understand the man who became Augustus, is whether Octavian agreed or whether he fought against it. Two ancient sources claim that Octavian argued for Cicero's life for 2 days before relenting. Those sources are Cassius Dio and Velleius Paterculus. Both were writing under emperors who were direct political descendants of Augustus. Both had every professional incentive to portray the founder of the imperial line as a reluctant participant in its worst atrocity. Two other ancient sources, Appian and Plutarch, writing with less political investment, describe all three triumvirs as equally culpable. No hesitation, no 2 days of argument. A barter, Cicero for someone else, Antony wanted. Murder for murder, as Plutarch put it. The logic of the situation supports the less flattering account. Cicero alive, even in exile, even across the sea, was a contradiction of everything the Second Triumvirate represented. His voice, his pen, his decades of political network could rally opposition, keep the idea of the Republic alive in the minds of the men who might still fight for it. The Proscriptions required, above all, that the Republic's defenders be silenced. Cicero was the most prominent defender the Republic had. He was always going to die. The only real question was how long Octavian would take to agree to it. Cicero tried to escape by sea. He fell ill before he could board. He was forced ashore near his villa at Formiae, carried by his slaves toward the coast through the winter air, barely able to move. His people lied about his location. They moved him through the dark. They did everything they could for as long as they could. In the end, a local man, a shoemaker, a private citizen, a man whose name history has not preserved, told the hunters exactly where to find him. The soldiers caught up with him in the woods. He was being carried in a litter, the curtain drawn. There was no chase, no desperate flight. When the litter stopped, Cicero pulled the curtain aside himself. He looked at the soldiers. He told his slaves to put the litter down. And then, according to multiple accounts, he offered his neck. The centurion hesitated. Then he drew his sword. Cicero's head was brought back to Rome. His hands, the hands that had written the Philippics, were brought back separately, on Antony's specific instructions. They were nailed to the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, the place where Cicero had delivered hundreds of speeches, where he had stood and argued and pleaded and insisted year after year that the Republic was worth saving, the head between the hands, facing outward. A message written in flesh for anyone who still thought that words were enough. Antony's wife Fulvia is said to have taken a hairpin and driven it through the dead tongue. Whether or not that detail is true, it captures something real about the moment. The Republic's voice was gone, not defeated in argument, not voted down in the Senate, nailed to the rostra it had once commanded. What replaced it was the sound of a city that had learned, very quickly, to say nothing at all. The machine did not work perfectly. This is worth understanding, because it shapes everything that follows. The proscriptions were designed to eliminate opposition completely, to clear the board of every man who might organize resistance, fund an army, or simply keep the idea of republican government alive in the minds of Romans who remembered what it had been. And yet the machine had a flaw built into its logic. Every man it drove out of Rome, it drove directly into the arms of its enemies. Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, commanding a fleet from his base in Sicily, was watching the proscriptions with considerable interest. He announced his own policy. Anyone who helped a proscribed man escape to his ships would be rewarded. Any proscribed man who reached Sicily would find sanctuary. The offer was genuine. Sextus enforced it. Men fled. Senators, military tribunes, officers who had commanded legions and knew how to train soldiers and plan campaigns. Every man the proscriptions drove out of Rome arrived in Sicily with two things: military experience and an undying grievance. Sextus Pompey's force, which had been relatively modest at the start of this period, became by the end of it a serious naval power with experienced leadership, deep motivation, and no possibility of surrender. The triumvirs had created their next war with the same instrument they were using to secure their position. Inside Rome, there were acts of courage that the historical record preserved because Romans needed them to be true, needed to believe that not everyone had surrendered to the fear. A senator named Capito barricaded himself in the narrow entrance to his own doorway and fought there, cutting down hunters one at a time in the confined space where they could only come at him singly. He was eventually overwhelmed and killed, but he made them work for it. Sons carried elderly fathers on their shoulders through the city gates at night, disguised as slaves. One slave, hearing soldiers approaching the house, swapped clothes with his master, lay down in his master's bed, and was killed in his place. The master, dressed as a slave, stood nearby and watched, and lived. These stories were recorded not because they changed the outcome. They did not. But they were the stories people told afterward because they needed them. Because in a city where children reported their fathers and wives handed over their husbands for coin, you needed to know that somewhere in the horror, something recognizably human had managed to survive. And then there was Hortensia. When the triumvirs, finding that confiscated property was harder to auction than anticipated, Rome's surviving wealthy were too terrified to appear wealthy, to bid, to show money, announced an unprecedented tax on the richest women of Rome. Something unexpected happened. Hortensia, daughter of one of Rome's great lawyers, organized the women. She led a delegation to the Forum. She walked past the soldiers. She stood before the triumvirs and she spoke, in public, to the men who controlled every army in the Western world. Her argument was 3 sentences long in its essentials. If Rome fought a foreign enemy, the women would support the war. But this was a civil war, Romans killing Romans, and the women had not caused it, had no voice in it, had no power to stop it, and would not be taxed to fund it. The triumvirs ordered the women removed from the Forum. The crowd pushed back. And in a calculation that reveals something important about how power actually functions, the triumvirs retreated. The tax was reduced from 1,400 women to 400. It was a small retreat. It changed nothing fundamental about the proscriptions, but it marked a boundary, and the triumvirs knew it was a boundary. There is a point beyond which terror stops producing compliance and starts producing the only thing that people with nothing left to lose can produce: defiance. The triumvirs were not there yet, but Hortensia had shown them where the edge was. The lists continued into 42 BC, months of it. The final count, formally documented, 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians proscribed, roughly 1/3 of the entire Roman Senate. The actual death toll, including those killed without formal listing, those who died in flight, those who ended their own lives before the hunters arrived, cannot be calculated with precision. It was enormous, and it was still not enough. The property auctions were failing. Rome's surviving wealthy class was too frightened to appear wealthy. To bid on a confiscated estate was to announce that you had money, and announcing that you had money was an invitation to be added to the next list. The triumvirs sat on enormous inventories of seized property they could not sell. They resorted to forcing male property owners to loan money directly to the state. The machine kept demanding fuel, and the fuel kept running short. In the east, Brutus and Cassius had spent 2 years preparing. They now commanded between 17 and 20 legions drawn from Macedonia, Syria, and the client kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a refugee army. It was a serious, experienced, well-supplied military force led by 2 men who had thought carefully about what they were going to do when this moment came. Their plan was simple and, in its own terms, correct. Avoid decisive engagement. Let the triumvirs' supply lines stretch and fray. Let the men in Italy grow hungry and restless. Let time do the work. It was the right strategy, and it required only one thing to work: patience. There was another problem, smaller in one sense and enormous in another. Octavian was sick. He had been sick during the engagements near Mutina. He would be sick at Philippi. His body failed him repeatedly in moments of maximum physical and psychological stress, a pattern his enemies noted and mocked, and his supporters quietly suppressed. The young man who had signed death warrants in Rome with the cold efficiency of an accountant could not, in the field, always remain upright. The triumvirs could not wait. The money the proscriptions had generated was already committed. The legions were moving. Every week of delay was a week Sextus Pompey grew stronger. A week Brutus and Cassius had to consolidate their position in the east. A week the political situation in Italy had to deteriorate further. In the late summer of 42 BC, the triumvirs' armies crossed the Adriatic. The endgame of the proscriptions was about to be settled on a plain in Macedonia. The plain near Philippi was chosen by geography as much as strategy. Marshes to the south, mountains to the north. The Via Egnatia, the great road connecting Rome's eastern provinces, running directly through the middle. It was a battlefield that offered limited room to maneuver and made retreat extremely costly. Both sides understood this. Both sides had reasons to want it decided here. The triumvirs had a timeline problem. Their supply lines crossed the Adriatic Sea, and Sextus Pompey was harassing those lines with his fleet. Every week they delayed was a week their position weakened. Brutus knew this. He wanted to wait, to hold his fortified position, and let hunger and logistics do what his legions did not need to. Cassius, more aggressive, pushed for engagement. His argument won. The first battle was fought in October of 42 BC. It went badly for the Republicans, but not in the way you might expect. Antony's wing, on the southern part of the line, broke through Cassius's position with real force. But simultaneously, in the north, Brutus broke through Octavian's lines entirely, broke them, overran them, found Octavian's tent empty when they reached it, the young triumvir having withdrawn from his position before the fighting reached him. One ancient source says he was in the marshes, ill and terrified. The details are disputed. The humiliation is not. But Cassius did not know about Brutus's success in the north. His messengers could not reach him in time. He saw his own position collapsing, saw what he believed was the rout of the entire Republican line. And rather than wait for confirmation, rather than pause for the few minutes that might have changed everything, he ordered a slave to kill him. The slave obeyed. Cassius was dead on false information. He died because the battle he believed he was losing was, at the same moment, also being won on a flank he could not see. He died because he did not wait. And with him died the cooler mind of the Republican command, the man most likely to hold the strategy of patience that might, given time, have worked. Brutus, the idealist, was now in command of everything. Brutus, who believed in the justice of his cause so completely that he had sometimes confused justice with strategy. 3 weeks passed. The Republican army grew cold, restless, demoralized. Brutus's officers pushed for action. The supply situation was no better for the Republicans than for the triumvirs. Waiting was not working as cleanly as the plan required. And Brutus, under pressure from all sides, attacked. Antony's generalship on his flank was as close to perfect as ancient warfare allowed. He read the attack, held his position, found the seam in Brutus's line, and drove through it. The Republican formation broke. By evening it was over. Brutus fled into the hills with a small party of men. That night, or perhaps the following day, he died. Whether by his own hand or with assistance, the sources do not agree. He was 43 years old. He had believed, until the end, that he was fighting for something real. The last Republican army was gone. Antony had won the battles. He had made the tactical decisions. He had stood in the field and fought. And when the world was divided afterward, Antony took the east, the wealthier half, the stable half, Egypt and the grain and Cleopatra and the endless wealth of the Orient. Octavian was given the west. Italy, exhausted and resentful, Spain, Africa, and the task of resettling 100,000 veterans on Italian land that would have to be taken from farmers who had committed no crime, who had fought for no side, who had simply owned fields in the wrong province at the wrong moment. The Proscriptions had funded this campaign. 300 dead senators had paid for the armies that stood on that plain in Macedonia. Without the money those deaths generated, the Eastern campaign might never have reached Philippi. Without Philippi, Brutus and Cassius survive. The Republican cause continues, and the history of the next 2,000 years looks entirely different. The killing was the foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. The Senate that the Proscriptions had destroyed could not be rebuilt. A third of its members were dead or in exile. Those who remained were men who had learned, over the course of several months, that compliance was the only reliable survival strategy. The Senate, that had once checked consuls, debated policy, balanced power across competing factions, that Senate was gone. What remained wore its robes and met in its chamber and passed its decrees, and none of it meant what it once had. The land problem was more immediate and more visceral. Octavian had promised his veterans farms. This was not optional. It was the contract at the heart of the Roman military system. Soldiers did not serve for wages. They served for the promise of land at the end of it, a plot in Italy, a life after the war. 28 Italian cities were designated for veteran settlement. Their existing populations were removed. In some places, this was organized. In others, it was simply soldiers arriving with authority, and the populations leaving because the alternative was worse. Cremona was largely emptied. Mantua suffered because it bordered Cremona, and proximity was close enough to guilt. A young farmer's son from that area, a poet named Publius Virgilius Maro, whose family's land was taken in the confiscations, would go on to write the Aeneid, Rome's greatest epic, a poem about a man who loses everything and builds a civilization anyway, about the violence that lies beneath every foundation, about whether the price of greatness can ever truly be paid. It is almost impossible to read it without hearing, somewhere behind the verse, the sound of a family losing its farm to men with swords and a government document. Sextus Pompey, armed with the experienced military men the proscriptions had driven into his ranks, tightened his grip on the sea lanes around Sicily. Italy's grain supply began to choke. The war against him would consume most of the following decade and cost another enormous expenditure of blood and money. It was, in every meaningful sense, the war the proscriptions had made. Every senator driven into Sextus's camp had brought military knowledge. Every grievance had been converted into motivation. The machine had built its own most dangerous enemy. Lepidus lasted until 36 BC. When the campaign against Sextus ended in Sicily, he attempted to seize the island for himself, a final bid for the relevance that had been slipping from him for years. Octavian responded not with a battle, but with a walk. He walked into Lepidus's camp and spoke to the soldiers there, told them what he was offering, and watched, in real time, as the men who had marched under Lepidus's eagles began, one by one, to pledge loyalty to the man with Caesar's name instead. Lepidus watched his army dissolve around him and could do nothing. He was stripped of everything except the office of Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest religious title, stripped of any political power, a dignified shell, and sent to live under house arrest. He survived for another 20 years. He died in 13 BC. By the time he died, most of Rome had forgotten he had ever mattered. Octavian became Augustus in 27 BC. The Senate voted him the title. They voted him the name, a word that carried connotations of reverence, sanctity, divine favor, something more than human authority. No Roman had ever held it before. Every Roman emperor for the next 5 centuries would hold it after him. He spent the following 4 decades constructing an image with the same patient precision he had applied to everything else. Clemency, piety, the restorer of the Republic, the man who ended the civil wars, the bringer of peace. He called himself princeps, first citizen, rather than dictator or rex. He maintained the Senate, the elections, the magistracies, the forms of the Republican Constitution. He kept the shape of the old system and replaced its substance with himself, so gradually and so skillfully that contemporaries who had lived through the transition sometimes struggled to identify the exact moment it had occurred. This was not accident. It was design. The historians who wrote under him helped. Cassius Dio spent considerable effort explaining that Octavian had argued against the proscriptions, had been an unwilling participant, had demonstrated from the beginning a merciful nature that the circumstances of the time had temporarily overridden. Velleius Paterculus constructed a similar account. Both were writing under rulers whose legitimacy descended from Augustus. Both had every reason to tell a story in which the monster and the statesman were different men rather than the same one. Appian and Plutarch, writing with less political investment, said something simpler and harder. All three men were equally responsible. The barter was murder for murder. The proscriptions were not an aberration from the Augustan project. They were its foundation. This is the insight that 2,000 years of Augustan mythology has worked very hard to prevent you from reaching. The Pax Romana was real. The peace was real. The roads were real. The law was real. The literature, Virgil, Horace, Livy, Ovid, was extraordinary by any measure. Augustus built something that genuinely lasted, that genuinely gave millions of people across the Mediterranean world a better and more stable life than they would otherwise have had. None of that is false, but it was purchased, specifically with the confiscated property of 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians, with the silencing of Cicero, with the systematic destruction of every institution that might have offered an alternative. The Golden Age was real. The price was also real. And the man who paid it spent the rest of his very long life. He died at 75, outlasting all of his enemies and most of his friends, working to ensure that posterity would remember the age and not the cost. He nearly succeeded. We still call him Augustus. Here is what the proscriptions of 43 BC actually reveal, if you are willing to look at them directly. They reveal that the second triumvirate was not born in passion. It was born in a budget meeting. The lists were drawn up before the triumvirs entered Rome. The reward structure was designed in advance. The connection between specific deaths and specific funding requirements for the Eastern campaign was not improvised. It was calculated. This was not a crime of rage or grief or political panic. It was a crime of administration, systematic, efficient, effective. And that is the most disturbing thing about it. Not that it was monstrous, but that it was organized. They reveal that Octavian's later reputation for clemency was not exactly false. He did stop the killing eventually. He did rebuild institutions in his way. He did create a kind of order that was preferable to the chaos of the Civil War period. But clemency as a political strategy is only available to men who have first established, beyond any doubt, that they are capable of the alternative. Augustus could afford to be merciful because every Roman alive remembered what Octavian had signed. The mercy was real. It was also a performance, and the audience knew exactly what it was a performance of. They reveal something about power that Rome already knew, and that every subsequent civilization has had to relearn on its own terms. Power does not require justice. It requires legitimacy. And legitimacy is ultimately a matter of narrative, of who controls the story of what happened, and why it happened, and what it means. Octavian won that contest too. He won it so completely that we still use his honorific name, that we still date his era as a golden age, that the most common image of him in museums worldwide shows a man in serene command, hand raised, gaze calm, every inch the benevolent father of civilization. The man who signed the lists is not in those statues, but he was in that room. He was always in that room, and they reveal something about Cicero, about what it costs to fight for an idea with words in a world where the other side has armies, and whether that cost is ever worth paying. Cicero was not naive. He understood the danger. He wrote about it in his letters, discussed it with friends, knew what was coming long before it arrived. He kept speaking anyway, because he believed, with a conviction, that we can find either inspiring or heartbreaking, depending on our own beliefs about institutions. That the Republic was worth defending, even when defending it was fatal. Whether that was courage or futility is not a question history answers for us. It is a question we answer for ourselves, based on what we think political institutions are actually for. His head was eventually removed from the rostra and given a proper burial. The records do not tell us where. The rostra still stands partially in the Roman Forum. You can visit it today, on a quiet morning, before the tourists arrive. You can stand on those ancient stones and look out at the same space Cicero once commanded with his voice. The same space where his hands were nailed after his death, where the lists were posted before dawn, where the Republic ended not in a battle or a coup, but in a bureaucratic process, efficient and legal and final. It is one of the quietest places in Rome. It has always been. And in that silence, if you listen for it, the Proscriptions of 43 BC are still asking the same question they asked when they began. At what point does the cost of order exceed the value of what order is supposed to protect? At what point does the foundation corrupt the building? At what point does the man who claims to save the Republic become the reason it needed saving? Rome never answered it. Neither have we. That is where we leave this story today. If it reached you, if it made you see Augustus differently, or made you think harder about what we ask of the men we call great, share it with someone who should hear it. And until next time, remember, history is never as clean as the marble suggests.